It can be tough when you're starting out as a game designer to really feel like you're making any sort of meaningful progress. As you keep designing, as you keep playtesting, as you keep iterating, as you keep improving the skills you have as a designer, you're going to find out that you'll level up as a game designer and will be much better than you were before. So what are some signs that you might have leveled up as a game designer that you might not have even noticed? In this video, I want to go over 5 different things that I see in designers who I feel like have made that step up in their designing process, who have made a meaningful improvement in the way they approach their practice. Hi, I'm Matthew Dunstan. I'm a full-time board game designer based in Australia, and to date I've had over 60 games published all around the world. On this channel I like to talk about all things game design, from my experiences in the industry to tips and tricks that can help you as a beginning game designer. As always in these types of videos, these are just things from my perspective. Don't take them as specific criteria that you have to reach in order to progress as a game designer. These are just some things that I think are useful to think about, whether as a way of reflecting on your own progress and realizing that yes, you've actually got a lot better than where you started, or maybe some things that you can work towards if you feel like you haven't made these steps yet. The first difference I see when a designer has made a level up is how they approach feedback from playtesting. When you start as a game designer, I think playtesting can be really difficult for a couple of different reasons. One is that it's just difficult to put your creation out in front of other people for them to critique it. That's really tough, and actually I don't think that ever really changes. I still have that problem when I put my prototypes in front of people. I'm a bit sheepish and don't want them to not like what I've put all this work into. But another aspect that's quite difficult is how you actually react to feedback and action it in terms of iterating for your next playtest. When you start out in game design, it can be very hard to filter all the different feedback you're going to get from your different playtesters. Each playtester is always going to bring their own specific view and perspectives to bear when they playtest your game, and that will influence the type of feedback that they give you. Maybe there's a particular style of game that they really like, and they might want your game to fit more into that style. Or potentially there's a mechanism that they really don't like, and if that's in your game, then they're going to react quite negatively to it. And at the start, it can be very hard to discern between which bits are actually useful feedback. And often what I see is that designers try to actually fit in all the feedback they get into the next prototype. They're trying to fit in all the suggested changes, change all the problems that were found by playtesters, and often that can lead to a prototype that doesn't make much sense anymore. It doesn't have a specific direction, or it doesn't have its own character or its own purpose. In short, it's a bit of a mess. The thing I see with designers who have made that clear level up as game designers is their ability to filter different forms of feedback from their playtests. They're able to discern which pieces of information are salient that they should use to improve their prototype for the next playtest, and they know which other bits of feedback are worth certainly noting down and recording, but that they don't have to implement for the next prototype. I like to always say that there's a clear distinction between the job of a playtester and the job of a designer when it comes to playtesting. For playtesters, their job is to identify problems with the game, things that don't work, or that for whatever reason give them a not great feeling when they're playing the game. They're identifying the problems. It's the designer's job to then come up with solutions to those problems. Where you can get mixed up is when you start taking all the solutions offered to you by playtesters, which I should say are often offered freely and with good intent. But they're not the people designing your game. They're not the people who know your overall goal for the game, how everything fits together. And trying to shoehorn their different solutions into your game often does lead to a bit of a mess. Take people's feedback, try and work out what problem it's really talking about. Sometimes playtesters will talk about things on a very surface level, and you need to be able to get past that surface level to try and understand what's below that comment. Don't worry if you don't feel like you're there yet and be able to filter feedback. This is something that really comes with experience and a certain confidence of you knowing what your game is really wanting to be. When you know what your game wants to be, it's very easy to take feedback that is useful to that and fits with your vision, and ignore feedback which is outside that vision you have for your game. When you start out as a game designer, you're going to work on pretty much whatever you find interesting. Whatever idea you have, you might start making a prototype for it and then trying to playtest it. There's no sense of trying to second guess yourself and work out whether an idea is any good or whether it's worth making a prototype, because you don't have any experience. You're just going to start working on whatever idea seems best at the time, or what interests you the most. And that is perfectly natural and makes sense. But I see a clear level up as a game designer is when you get better filtering of your own ideas that leads to a higher percentage of games that you start making becoming finished games and games that you can pitch to publishers. When you start, it's very easy to get stuck working on a game just because you started in the first place. This is what they call the sunk cost fallacy, where you feel like once you've put a certain amount of work into a prototype, Well, you have to keep seeing it through, otherwise you've just wasted all that time you put into making the game previously. But sometimes actually an idea just wasn't that good, and after a few bad playtests, it's actually the best thing is to abandon a prototype, put it on a shelf, or even never see it again. So the first step to leveling up in this area is starting to recognize earlier on in your prototype process when a game might just not be working very well and when it's worth just putting aside for a while. Whether that's after the first, second, or third playtest, hopefully you can get better at seeing it more early on in the process, so you do fewer iterations, fewer reworks of a prototype before you realize that the idea is not worth pursuing any further. And the next step beyond this is the ability to actually filter your ideas before you even make a first prototype. And again, this is something that really comes with experience. As you have more and more ideas and as you make more and more prototypes, you have a better way of predicting how a game will act or whether it'll be any good at the idea stage without needing a prototype to validate what you think will happen. Something you need to be able to do as a full-time game designer is to be able to filter the ideas you have and work out which ones are really worth putting time into. You only have a finite amount of time to work on projects, and if you start too many projects, if you try to work on too many ideas at once, then nothing's going to get finished. You're never going to be able to put enough time and work and effort into one prototype to fully flesh it out and make it an excellent game. And the key to that is filtering out ideas at the start, reducing the amount of projects you even start in the first place, reducing the number of first prototypes you make, because that saves you a whole bunch of time by not working on ideas that aren't any good. Now, I should say, it doesn't guarantee success. Sometimes you, of course, will start on a game thinking it's good after going through all this filtering, and it still might not be any good after 1 or 2 playtests. And I'm sure I might have missed a really good idea because I dismissed it at the idea stage. But overall, I think being able to prune out ideas earlier on in the process, either before making a first prototype, or after a few playtests, rather than going to many, many more playtests, saves you a lot of time and grants you a lot of efficiency in the game design process. And I see this as a clear level up as you go from a beginning to more experienced game designer. When you start out, it's very easy to be influenced by other games out there, and especially seeing particular trends in mechanisms or themes, and wanting to follow those trends and make a game in that same style. And this makes perfect sense. We're all inspired by different things, and a natural place to be inspired by is in other published games. And I should say, this is actually a really great way to start designing, because it's much easier to imitate something that already exists than to necessarily create something more novel from the start. But what I really see as a designer progresses and becomes more experienced and levels up is this idea of starting to make games that only that designer could make. Really understanding what their own style and preferences are, and their own unique experiences and perspectives on the world, and how that can inform their own game design. If you're only ever following trends, especially as a more experienced game designer, you have to understand that you're actually always going to be 2 to 3 years behind what's on the market. Because the games that are being published now, they were signed 2, 3, or 4 years ago with their publishers, and they took that amount of time to develop and produce them, and now they're only coming out and being available for sale. So if you start working on a game like that now, well, it's going to be another 2 or 3 years until your game appears on the market, and then you're behind the trend. That trend was 2 or 3 years ago. So in some ways, it's not even a particularly effective strategy to try and follow trends. But instead, if you try and create your own trend by making a game that only you could make, then that's a much more effective way to make a game that will stand out in the market. Think about what types of experiences, what preferences, what things you love to do or love to look at, love to study. Think about all those things that make you a unique person as opposed to all the other game designers out there. And then take those different experiences and knowledge and put them into a game. Think about what type of game could you make that nobody else could make because only you have that unique combination of interests and experiences. Not only approaching game design in this way will be much more enjoyable because you're going to be working on games that relate to your hobbies and interests that you already like, but it's also going to lead to a game which is not only going to stand out on the market because it's going to be different from other things out there, but it's going to be so much more genuine because the design of that game is coming from someone who truly loves the things in them. For example, for a long time, I've really wanted to make a Eurovision game because I really love the Eurovision Song Contest. And I know that if I were to make a game about the Eurovision Song Contest, it would be something that would really stand out because I'm bringing all my love and experience for the contest into that game design. I'm not following other things that are already out there in the market and hopefully it would stand out, if I was ever given the chance to make a Eurovision game, of course. It can take some time for this sense of self and your own style to develop as a designer, and at the start it's very normal to try lots of different things and to try imitating other games out there. That's how you learn. But over time, as designers become more experienced, I really see this level up in terms of becoming themselves and really injecting something of themselves into their designs, and you can really see that clearly. I think someone who is such a fantastic example of this is Elizabeth Hargrave. You can see in all of her games, not just Wingspan, her love of nature and different animals really goes into her game designs, and the amount of detail that she brings to those games, which is informed by her own interests, is amazing. And those games that she makes could only be made by her because they are a combination of her unique game design talents and her interests, and that's how you get games that stand out long after they're published. A very common question that you hear asked a lot in interviews about game design is, do you start with a mechanism or do you start with a theme? And realistically, I see more mechanism-driven designs earlier on in a game designer's journey. Mechanisms are easier to replicate, to take from different games, and to use in new designs. Perfectly great way to start. But one thing I really see as game designers get more experienced and improve their chances of getting their games published is when they start considering new projects as a whole game holistically, rather than a collection of mechanisms. They don't just think about the mechanisms that might be present in a game, they think about the type of theme and setting that they could present, they think about the components, they think about the possible audience for the game, they might even think about what publishers would be a great fit for it. And all of these things are going into the design from the very start, maybe before they even make a first prototype. And when you have these ideas in mind while you make that first prototype, it's going to be so much closer to a publishable game from the very start because you've already started to consider so much more than just what mechanisms are going to be present. There's a couple of reasons why this is quite an important level up. Firstly is when you only have a mechanism, it's very easy to get stuck in a game design. I referenced this in a previous video where if you have a particular mechanism in your game and it seems to be working well, that doesn't necessarily suggest all the other things that are going on in the game. One mechanism doesn't suggest other mechanisms that should go with it. However, if you have a strong holistic vision for your game, which is not just the mechanisms, but also its theme, its setting, its components, all those other things will start suggesting other mechanisms, other ways of playing the game that might marry well with that original mechanism. They do a great job at suggesting how you're going to progress with the game as you keep designing it. And that can be really useful to make sure you don't get stuck in the design. But the other point that is really important is I think it just makes better games. I think the best games are ones where all the aspects of the game, its product design, its illustrations, its theme, its setting, its mechanisms, its components, when they all work in concert together to provide a unified game experience, that it all makes sense together. And the earlier that you're able to consider all these parts and how they might work together, the easier it is to make sure that they do work together. The much harder thing is when a game design starts where it only considers perhaps a mechanism or a collection of ways of playing and doesn't really have a theme at all, and as the game progresses and is iterated, a theme is added to it much later on in the process. And that can be really jarring because you have these mechanisms that are kind of set in stone at that point, and then you have to find a theme that fits with those rather rigid mechanisms. And often it feels like that theme was an afterthought. But if you start with both theme and mechanism very early on in the process, then they can each inform each other as you're moulding the game. And the game that will result from that will feel like the theme and the mechanisms make sense with each other. They marry well together and they provide a unified experience that players will enjoy more. One thing that I see from a minority of game designers, I should say this is not all beginning game designers, but quite a few beginning game designers, see the greater game design community as something that they can just get something from, that they just want to take something from. For example, they see playtesters as people who are just going to give them their time, give them feedback on their game, and then they can go on and work on it and make it better. Or they see other game designers as merely people who can give them information or advice, and then they're going to take it and use it later on in their game design journey. And to a certain degree, this is perfectly fine. When you're starting out, you don't have a lot of information or knowledge, and you are relying on other people to be able to help you along in that game design journey. It's exactly why I set up this channel. I want to help people who are earlier on in the game design journey and help them get to where I am. And I only got to where I am because of the advice and generosity and time that was given to me by other game designers back when I started. So that's perfectly fine. Another thing that I see at the starting point is that some designers can view other designers as competitors. that we're all working against each other in this limited space to try and get our games published. And if somebody else gets their games published, well, that's reducing my chance of getting my game published. They sort of took a slot that I could have used. And as a result, they're very protective of their ideas. They don't want to share them freely. They're reticent to take feedback sometimes from some designers who they view as competitors. And it overall leads to not a very collaborative or enjoyable experience. But the real moment I think you level up as a game designer, in the sense of being a part of the greater game design community, is when you realize that you get so much more about giving to the community than anything you might take from it. And that actually the wonderful thing about the game design community is that people are so generous with their time, their advice, their contacts, that they just want everyone else to succeed. And that actually we can all succeed together as a game design community by collaborating with each other, by being generous with our time, by being generous with our advice. And that you as a game designer can be a part of that as well. Getting to know other people in the community isn't about a transaction where you're simply trying to get something from someone. It's about how you can contribute to this overall network that can welcome new people in and help them become better game designers, just as you've become a better game designer. And this type of contribution can be different depending on what type of game designer you are. Some more experienced game designers are amazing playtesters. Some give excellent advice as to which publishers might be a good fit for the game that they've just playtested. Others will try and share different game design advice on the internet, like I'm doing. Or even some designers are just a really friendly part of the community and make the other people present feel more comfortable and welcome just by them being there. As you become more experienced as a game designer, maybe think about how can I contribute back to this game design community that I've probably got a lot from to get to this point. And in the end, we all benefit from everybody pitching in and helping each other. I think it's one of the best things about the game design community, maybe compared to some other professional communities. Generally, we all want to see each other succeed, and we're happy to do whatever we can to help those people. And you can be a part of that. So it's something to think about as you level up as a game designer. So I hope that's some food for thought as you continue on your game design journey. Do let me know in the comments below if you think you've made some of these level ups as a game designer and how it feels for you as you reflect back on that journey that you've made. Or if you're more at a beginning stage, maybe let me know what your current goals are. What are the things you're trying to work on and level up in your own game design practice? Even if not the 5 that I talked about here. As I said before, these are only 5 that I thought of. There are many different ways to improve as a game designer, and I'd love to hear what you think about them in the comments below. But as always, thanks very much for watching, and all the best with your game designs. Bye.